They wanted to stay put until their hometowns were freed by Ukrainian troops. But now, scores of people living in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine are scrambling to leave. Hope for liberation has faded ever since the Kremlin announced a staged vote to annex 4 regions under its control. Desperate to create facts on the ground, Russia is looking to seize 15% of Ukrainian territory in a move the West has vowed to never recognize.
Vote organizers in Donetsk making house calls, bringing the ballot boxes straight to the people. Amid the backdrop of war, residents are being asked to vote on joining the Russian Federation.
Of course it's important. We were wondering when we would join Russia. Life will be calmer.
The so-called referendums are being held over 5 days. Russian news outlets say most of the voting will take place door to door. Kremlin-installed leaders in the regions have been preparing for months, signing up residents as Russian citizens. In Luhansk, some see the vote as a way out of war and deprivation.
I think the referendum will be for the best. Yes, that there will be water and electricity, and people will feel like they are on their native land.
But for those who fled to Ukrainian-held parts of Zaporizhia, the votes are a sham.
It's a violation of international law. It's a fake task to show that occupied territories want to join the Russian Federation, which is a total lie.
Once the so-called referendums are completed, Moscow could then claim that its own territory is under attack with weapons provided by the West.
Let's now bring in Catherine Lawler. She's a senior analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. Welcome. How closely linked, do you think, are these sham referendums in occupied Ukraine to the mobilization order in Russia?
I think they're closely interrelated. Announcing annexation and mobilization within 1 week of one another makes that clear. And there's a few reasons behind this. So one of the driving forces behind both is the recent success of Ukrainian counteroffensives. Putin expected this to be a 72-hour war, and instead he's 8 months in and he's losing. Ukrainian forces are taking back occupied Ukrainian territory bit by bit, and Russian forces are failing to hold their front lines. They desperately need more manpower. So the decision to forcibly mobilize hundreds of thousands of Russians is an attempt to address a few of the short-term needs of Russian forces. It allows them to backfill their front lines with untrained bodies, basically cannon fodder. And if they don't care about training their people, and a lot of evidence suggests they do not care about training this first wave of mobilized personnel any more than they've cared about training their volunteer battalion recruits, you can move some untrained forces forward quickly, but it's not going to have a practical effect. And one of the most likely reasons why Russian President Putin has linked annexation and mobilization is that he can now exploit a law that bans the deployment of conscripts who haven't done sufficient training to conflicts abroad. And if Ukrainian territory is suddenly Russian territory under Russian law, Russia can legally and openly deploy conscripts to the front lines. They've been doing that all along, but they'll increase those deployments.
But if you're saying that militarily it won't make a difference if you throw, let me phrase it that way, bodies at the problem, why is he doing it?
I think Russian military leadership may believe that this will work, but it's actually going to exacerbate the logistical challenges and equipment shortages and may even cause more problems for Russia than for Ukraine. But I don't think they have a clear understanding of what's actually happening on the ground.
Let's talk about the annexation efforts. Large parts of Zaporizhia and Donetsk are not under Russian control at the moment. What do you think Putin's plan is there?
Honestly, I think the plan is incoherent. The Kremlin is going to find itself demanding that Ukrainian forces unoccupy supposedly Russian territory, but they won't be able to enforce that demand. And by choosing to illegally annex occupied Ukraine and calling it Russian territory, They might be hoping to deter additional Ukrainian counteroffensives and to deter Western military aid to Ukraine by falsely claiming that Western equipment is targeting Russian territory. But I think the Russians are underestimating the Western will to support Ukrainian sovereignty, as well as disregarding repeated and explicit Western statements that Ukraine is within its rights to use Western equipment against Russian forces on occupied Ukrainian soil, including in Crimea.
How willing do you think Russia is to escalate the conflict once there are counterattacks on what they perceive to be their own territory?
We'll have to wait and see, but Russian forces have not retaliated for Ukrainian attacks into Crimea in an escalatory way, and I wouldn't expect them to be capable of dramatic escalation in the near term while they're still mobilizing these forces.
To what extent will Ukrainians in the occupied territories be forced by Russia to fight against their own country now?
If Russia annexes these territories, which it will, conscription will absolutely apply to these newly annexed territories. Forced mobilization has been going on for years in the Russian proxy-controlled parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. In some villages that Russia has occupied since 2014, there are no Ukrainian men of fighting age left. And public preparations are already underway in places like Zaporizhia and Kherson to forcibly mobilize Ukrainian civilians to fight against the Ukrainian military, likely with a metaphorical or physical gun to their backs.
Already back in May, you correctly predicted all of what we're seeing today. How do you see the coming 3 months panning out?
Realistically, I don't think Russia is going to be able to raise enough quality troops to change the course of this war in the short term, and probably not in the long term either. These reservists, they're not trained. They're not reservists like we would think of in the US or Europe. Many have no experience or maybe 1 year's experience as a conscript decades ago. Many don't want to fight. So the Russians are making the same mistakes that they've made all along, and they're throwing untrained men at the front lines to backfill into units that are already totally degraded and demoralized. They're exacerbating their own logistical shortages. So I think the war isn't close to over. It's not going to end in the next 3 months, but Ukraine will conduct successive counteroffensives into the new year to continue to liberate its territory. And Russia's mobilization and annexation of occupied Ukraine won't change the facts on the ground, which are that Ukraine is advancing and Russian forces are falling apart.
We'll talk again in 3 months then. That was Catherine Lawler at the Institute for the Study of War. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Maria Kuznetsova. She's a spokeswoman for OVD Info, an independent NGO monitoring political prosecution in Russia. Ms. Kuznetsova, do you see the mood shifting? Are more Russians now openly turning their back on Putin and his war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I would say that what we see now is a change of the regime, because for many years there was an agreement between Russian society and Vladimir Putin that the authorities do not intervene in personal lives of people, and in exchange of that, people do not ask questions about politics and about human rights violations. But that has already changed since Wednesday, and we definitely see a lot of people protesting who have never done that, and especially a lot of women joined protests. We have never seen such numbers of women protesting.
The protests we are seeing, though, are mostly taking place in the bigger cities, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. How big is dissent really in the rest of the country?
It's difficult to say precise numbers, but we've registered at least a few detentions in more than 40 Russian cities. So it's definitely not just about Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's also about Far East, Siberia, and Central Russia.
In your latest report with OVD Info, you documented some of the arrests and some of the things that happened to people who went out to protest and were arrested. They were beaten. They were, some of them, forced into conscription. We're fairly used to seeing authorities crack down on dissent in Russia. What's different this time?
I would say that police is much more brutal now, even comparing to what happened in February and March. And what's really different is that 88% of people detained at protests in St. Petersburg, for example, they got arrests of 8 to 10 days after the protest. We have never seen such big numbers of people being arrested after the protest for, just a period of time. And it's also that 99% of people who went to the court after the protest are found guilty of illegal protests. And it's also a shift. And I would say what's unique is that now the police is openly calling protesters traitors, fascists, Nazis, and say that after the protest you will go to the war because it's your punishment.
To what extent do you think, though, all of that we're seeing right now, the protests, the dissent, the arrests, will have a tangible impact on the war in Ukraine and Putin's effort to bolster troops?
As we see now is that a lot of people are fleeing the country, for example, and I would say that both protests and people living cannot directly influence what's happening, but it can start other ways of social disobedience in Russian society, maybe stopping to work or just, living works in mass amounts. And I would say that probably will have a huge impact. But still, I think it's really important that people try, not to go to the war, and just shows that Russians are those there are a lot of Russians who do not agree with the war.
Maria Kuznetsova of OVD Info, thanks for your time and all this information.
Thank you.
The United Nations is wrapping up its first in-person gathering of world leaders since the start of the pandemic. Russia's escalation of the war in Ukraine has dominated proceedings in New York. The West, led by the United States, has condemned the Kremlin for making veiled threats to use nuclear weapons. Russia says Western allies have become party to the conflict by supplying weapons to Kyiv. Our DW correspondent Michaela Küfner is in New York City for us and is following the meeting. Michaela, has the UN resolved anything in terms of Ukraine?
Well, the UN simply can't because Russia is part of the Security Council. Now, its task is to maintain peace and security in the world, and it is completely dysfunctional. That is shown by the conflict in Ukraine. So the short answer is no, nothing was resolved here, certainly when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, that Russian aggression there. But the biggest tangible outcome is that clearly the trend is shifting against Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was at pains to maintain the rhetoric that Russia had been pushing from day one, that there was a liberation operation, that there was a suppression of Russians. Well, nobody is buying this here, and more countries simply want this conflict to go away. Russia is well on its way to becoming a pariah state, and that certainly helps those allies standing together trying to push back Russia.
Now, notably, China and India, two important UN powers, have not openly condemned Russia's actions. Do we know where they stand?
Yeah, this is a very interesting one. I mean, it clearly would be in China's interest to see Europe continuing and the United States continuing to struggle with this conflict. But Vladimir Putin made a huge mistake this week, for sure, when he made that second nuclear threat as all world leaders were gathering here. China wants to see itself in a role of a moderating force, but it wants this conflict to end. It's been quite clear in signaling that. And India, too, which is highly dependent on Russia because it's regionally so close, is also tangibly running out of patience, recognizing that war was actually started by the Russian side. So it's a lot in the diplomatic detail, but also very key allies are increasing their pressure, be it implicit or direct. Whether it's direct, we do not know. We're not on those conversations, on Vladimir Putin to back down. So whatever he threatens now, he will be pretty much alone on the world stage if he exacerbates that situation any further. And also there's many tiny countries, small countries here, who are simply running out of patience because they want to talk about the effects of climate change that their people are feeling every day. And once again, Ukraine dominated the agenda here.
Our correspondent Michaela Küfner there reporting from New York City. Thank you.